a great basic album, you know, a cool, I guess it goes this way. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Nathan on Shuffle, and this is another entry into my series of defining albums that I'm doing, where I go through kind of music history and pick out some of the big seminal classic defining albums. I started this project essentially to beef up my vinyl collection because I felt like I was lacking a lot of the classic albums that are just kind of necessary staples in any great music collection, specifically in the genres of, you know, classic rock and classic pop, and just to go through each year essentially and try to mine out the best, most important works from those times. So that's what this series is doing. Last time I covered Chicago and their classic second album. This time I'm going to talk about Led Zeppelin and another kind of similar thing where it's their fourth album, which is technically Untitled, but people have come to call it Four because it's their fourth album and their first three albums are numbered. So this is kind of along that vein, and so I picked up, of course, the album here of Led Zeppelin, and just a great basic album, you know, a cool inside gatefold kind of thing going on. Just a basic but great package of vinyl there. I'm really excited, and I've listened to the album. Of course, I've heard all of this music before. This isn't brand new to me. I picked this because I was familiar and knew it was such a great album, and this is kind of, to me, they're one of their biggest achievements. I love this album a lot. I think it's just kind of perfect classic rock. I think it's kind of the perfect album that just really showcases the genre in a great way. Led Zeppelin, of course, are an English band formed in London in 1968, featuring Robert Plant on vocals, Jimmy Page as the guitarist, John Paul Jones as bass/keyboards, and drummer John Bonham. Just a classic lineup. And what's cool about Led Zeppelin is that's the lineup. You know, there's not big lineup shifts and changes. They stuck with that form of band members and throughout their, you know, main career of their studio albums. So I've listened to their studio album. That's part of the process of this, is listening to all their studio albums, even surrounding the one I've chosen as their defining, you know, album. I've kind of, along this process, been creating these Spotify playlists, which I'm going to link to in the description if you're interested, of like pulling out my favorite tracks and kind of making this ultimate collection of my favorite tracks from them. And for Led Zeppelin, of course, a lot of it's the big classics that you would expect, and maybe a couple sprinkled things that are a little bit lesser known. But of course, with Led Zeppelin, everything's really well known. I mean, they're a huge band and all of their albums are huge and well regarded as classics, so nothing will surprise you, I don't think. But just if you're interested in my taste and my mixture of tracks, it's something I've been exploring. But this album, to me, is kind of the perfect representation of who they are. I think it really is a crowning achievement for them. And it may not even be my favorite album of theirs, but I just feel like in its place in history, it deserves a spot on this list of defining albums, as I'm defining that, what that even means. Especially side one is just like perfection. It's classic rock perfection. Every track is a total classic of the genre. The album starts with Black Dog. It just starts with a bang with this classic rock song that every classic rock fan should be familiar with. It's really fun and has some great playing, great guitar riff that's kind of iconic. Great vocals by Robert Plant. He has these moments where he does these vocals without the music, and then the music pops back in. So it's a really classic song leading into Rock and Roll, which is just, you know, a perfect classic rock and roll song. You know, it's paying tribute to kind of the classic rock and roll of the 50s and early 60s, and just has a really cool vibe to it, kind of that bluesy rock and roll vibe. Battle of Evermore is one of my personal favorites. I really love it because it's sweet. It kind of has these great vocal harmonies between Robert Plant and Sandy Denny from Fairport Convention. I think the only time that you hear female vocalists on a Led Zeppelin studio track. Definitely a cool feature here that I think really complements the music really well. This kind of Lord of the Rings inspired track, but with these beautiful vocals and this mandolin playing. I believe I read that Jimmy Page wrote this on mandolin, even though that's not really his primary instrument. And that was kind of the inspiration, was the mandolin part of the song. So really cool, one of my favorites. And then Stairway to Heaven, I mean, everyone's talked about it. It's not anything I could really add to the conversation about. It's a classic. Just the acoustic guitar playing. It's something even I learned how to play very early on when I was like trying to learn guitar and stuff. And just as a disclaimer, I'm not a guitar player by any stretch, but I had an acoustic guitar in high school, and that's of course one of the first things I wanted to figure out how to play. And so I love it. The recorders, the slow build up, the excellent emotive vocals leading to this kind of outburst of a guitar solo and heavy towards the end. I just think it's the perfect classic rock song. And I know it's overplayed. I know everyone's heard it a million times, but not everyone. I was talking to my wife about this Led Zeppelin stuff as I was preparing for this video and listening to these songs, and she wasn't at all familiar with Stairway to Heaven, which I thought was like, how is that even possible? But it just wasn't something she'd really grown up with and heard, because she wasn't into classic rock at all. Her parents didn't share that with her. They liked the oldies of the 50s and stuff, and anything more rock in the late 60s and 70s was just too extreme for them, because they didn't grow up with it like some others have. So her only familiarity with Stairway to Heaven was that part in Wayne's World where they kind of talk about how, no stairway allowed when they're trying out guitars, I think. So that was her only reference, and she didn't even really understand that joke until I kind of explained, why that's funny. So I just thought that was a funny little aside that, even though it's seemingly everyone should have heard of that, not everyone has. I thought about doing a reaction video with Jan about it, but I've heard that Led Zeppelin's pretty strict on their blocking their videos, copyright strikes and things. So I'm not sure I'll go into that with her, but it would have been a fun one to go into and to talk through some of this. But I wanted to mention it here because I thought that was a funny little anecdote. And the second side is kind of different. It's has a little bit more, I don't know if experimentation is the right word, but it just has a lot of disparate tracks that are kind of a little bit unique in my opinion. Misty Mountain Hop is actually one that I really like a lot. It starts off with it has this fun, almost grooviness to it, and this cool electric piano that kind of starts it off. It's kind of unique in its way, and I think it fits really well here. And I like the kind of Hobbit reference of the title, even though the lyrics seem to be based around more of a real world type situation. I read that it was about a legalized pot rally where police made a lot of arrests towards people with marijuana, a lot of marijuana possession charges being taken. So it's kind of a take on that situation and how they felt about it. But the title of the track is based on The Hobbit. Four Sticks, another one that I wasn't really familiar with. It's kind of a more deep track from them. When you look at the classic Led Zeppelin tracks, I don't really think of this one, but it's really interesting and almost one of the more proggy moments. There's some interesting time signatures and a really cool drum pattern that's running throughout the song. It was called Four Sticks because of the drumming, because it required 4 drumsticks to play it, essentially, that tricky kind of drum pattern, and one that they didn't play very much live because of how tricky it was. So, but it's really interesting, and one that really stood out to me in this recent listen. So Going to California is one of my personal favorites. I love the kind of laid back acoustic vibe of it. It's one of their sweeter, kind of softer songs, and I think it really works. It's one of my favorite tracks from them. Kind of inspired by a Joni Mitchell folky kind of vibe. And finally, When the Levee Breaks, which is kind of this big blues rock epic that kind of closes the album, based upon an old blues standard from Kansas Joe McCoy and Memphis Minnie. But they're doing their own thing with it and really expanding it and doing a lot. To be honest, this isn't usually my typical bag. Some of their bluesier stuff is just not really to my taste, because it kind of hits upon a groove that just kind of it feels a bit samey throughout the track. I get kind of fatigued by hearing the same, bar over and over again, which is kind of what blues is. But they add a lot of stuff into the mix as well to kind of give it variety and infuse their own style to it. So, but I really love this album. I think it's perfect from start to finish. It's definitely a classic. Like I said, I listened to a lot of their albums in this process of wanting to talk about them, and I think I prefer Houses of the Holy. I think to me that's their best record, for my personal tastes. I really fell in love. I think there's a bit more experimentation that they're doing. It's a little bit more varied and has a lot of different things going on, that kind of bring a different side out of the band. But this album is really, if I was going to point someone to like, where should I start with Led Zeppelin? I think this is the best starting point, the best like real exploration into them and their most classic songs. So that's really my discussion about Led Zeppelin. Hopefully you enjoyed what I had to say. Like I said, if you're interested in my taste and what Led Zeppelin tracks that I appreciate the most, check out my Spotify playlist that I'll link in the description. It's a pretty expansive list of a lot of the classic Led Zeppelin songs. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and enjoy this series. I know it's probably not one of my more popular series, but I like being able to talk about these classic albums, so it's something that is really fun for me to do, so I'm still going to put these out basically on a monthly basis. So please subscribe if you like what I do here. Please continue commenting. Maybe mention what your favorite Led Zeppelin album or favorite Led Zeppelin tracks are. What would you put on a collection of best Led Zeppelin tracks? I'd be curious to see other people's opinions. Maybe what are your favorite, more deeper cuts of their albums? That's always interesting to me. I'm always trying to uncover those kind of hidden gems beyond just the big staples that everyone knows. So thank you guys again, and as always, keep enjoying the music. Thank you.